Oh, I've just seen that diagram.
Good gracious. I half inched it off the web, obviously. It's a high thumbnail view, so small active, something like that. So diminish or get rid of most photographs, and if you've got one still showing of any of us talking, top right hand corner, I'm keeping clear throughout. Good. This is quite a useful way of seeing the relationships of them, because it doesn't make any judgments about who copied who. It just said, well, this material is in all three, this material is in two of them, this material is unique to any one of them. It's fascinating, isn't it, how little there is that's unique to Mark, because all bar a very little of it is used by both Luke and Matthew. And can you see this on there? I've changed the slide. 96%, I make that, of Mark is 55% of Matthew. So he's choosing to use the whole of Mark. This diagram is also useful, but much simpler. I'm sure you know that the majority of scholarship thinks that the shared material between the three of them, which is why we call them synoptics, Matthew and Luke both use Mark, and both Matthew and Luke used another collection that we don't have. And it's no mystery. Q is simply 19th century German scholarship's way of saying there's a source. Quelle is German for source. So it's a source that we don't have, but there are sayings of Jesus that appear in both Matthew and Luke. Sometimes called the two-source hypothesis, and you might know it in that pattern, slightly more familiar a way of putting it, that there are 4 documents, is the way B.H. Streeter put it, because where I've written Matthew's independent sources, he tended to say Matthew's independent document, source document, and I've made it plural. And I think we could be talking about written and eyewitness oral accounts too. We don't know. We haven't got them. We don't know that Q existed. The alternative theory, can you see I've just taken out Q, is that Luke and Matthew used Mark, but Luke used Matthew as well. And that means that there'd be no need to say there's any such thing as Q, because that accounts for the material that's in both Luke and Matthew. I will revisit that when we do Luke. It frankly doesn't matter to us because you know, everybody thinks, bar 1 or 2 people, I guess, that Matthew uses Mark. There are independent sources or material unique to Matthew. So could you just reread through that small passage of Matthew for me? You know it's from the Gospel of Matthew. Even if you didn't, what are the words or phrases there that would tell you, I think that's Matthew's Gospel?
Kingdom of heaven.
Thank you, Nigel.
Kingdom of heaven.
Kingdom of heaven rather than kingdom of God. Not consistently, but mostly is Matthew's habit. Probably, and some people think it's got important distinction of meaning. Most of us think it's the Jewish sensibility of not overusing the name of God when you don't have to. Even Luke says there will be more rejoicing over the angels in heaven when a sinner repents. Basically, it means God will be happy, but it's a way of sort of not always coming that close to the name of God. What else, people, good people? Somebody unmute themselves, or You see anything else?
The reference to the commandments and the law without any backing it up. So he expects his readers to actually know exactly what he's talking about.
And repeated words, aren't they? Commandment, law, righteous is another one of those. Righteousness under the law, a whole nexus of words which recur. Good, very good. Any others?
A reference to scribes and Pharisees.
Very, very good. Absolutely. I think that's spot on. I've gone for the law, kingdom of heaven, righteousness, and scribes and Pharisees. You'll see the same pairing, scribes and Pharisees, in all of them, but quite a lot repeated in Luke as well. Pharisee and scribe, different things. Pharisee is somebody who's a member of a movement, and the movement was reviving Torah observance, pretty much in a community sense, in villages and so forth. A scribe was a job, teacher of the law. Almost all of the scribes or teachers of the law subscribe to the movement of the Pharisees, so they're often paired in that way. But one's a job and a role, they teachers of the law. Pharisee has no special standing. If individual Pharisees were leaders of their communities, they might be, as some of them were on the Sanhedrin, the National Council. But a Pharisee isn't a special officer. They're kind of belonging to a movement. I don't know, it's like calling somebody a Liberal Democrat or something. It's that sort of thing. Just while we're playing this game, does anybody fancy unmuting and saying, I think that's a particular gospel because of a particular word or two?
I think that's the Gospel of John.
Why do you think that?
It's this business of the phrasing, and this is eternal life. Words like, even the phrasing that they may know you.
Good.
Yeah, it just has that kind of Johannine ring.
Any other words there that anybody else thinks are Johannine?
In your presence before the world existed.
Yeah.
It's looping back to the prologue.
Yeah,
absolutely. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So, oops. I also went for whom you have sent, the sending of the Son, and then the sending of the Spirit is Johannine. Glory, the glorification, that's also in the prologue. Good. We'll play that game again when we start Luke. So when you're reading Luke, you might be thinking, how do I know this is Luke? Just by the words that appear and so forth. So each evangelist then has a different voice, along with their different concerns and their particular message. We saw last week, didn't we, that they use what material is available to them to bring over a message that is relevant to their context and the situation of their congregations. This timeline I will revert to from time to time has no authority other than I've put in some things which there is some agreement on, but not complete agreement by any means. Even Jesus' ministry, some people don't put their Jesus' death. We all put it, a lot of us put it 33, 34. Some people would put it at 30, some at 36. So, there just isn't complete agreement about the exact historical years. So don't get me into trouble over that. But I've given a rough consensus on the Gospel of Matthew. People either put it in the 80s or in the late 70s. That's pretty thorough in terms of scholarship. And Luke, we'll see next week, maybe 80 to 85. Obviously, if people think that Luke used Matthew, they have to have them in the right order. I don't. I'm a Q believer. We saw that 70 was a key date with the Jewish-Roman War in the span of the war 66-73, and the 70 is the destruction of Jerusalem and diaspora, major diaspora from Judea. I just want to mention another, it's not an event, it's a series of events. And that's the exclusion from synagogues of Jews who claim that Jesus is Messiah. John's Gospel refers to it. Synoptics don't refer to it. It was happening way back in the 30s. Jesus got kicked out of synagogues. So it's not surprising that his followers continued to. But there isn't really a single parting of the ways between Judaism and what we call Christianity. On the whole, through the first century, there wouldn't have been a sort of sense of there's Judaism and there's Christianity and they're separate religions. Christianity starts as a sect within Judaism that admitted Gentiles. And then there is, you know, in various ways, a parting of the ways. And some people will emphasize the decree, it's called a benediction, that was used in synagogues that's in about 85, that seems to formalize if you claim Jesus to be Messiah, you should not be worshipping in the synagogues. But it happened at different times in different places. And I think what we have in Matthew's church is a collection of, well, a synagogue with Jews who believe Jesus is a Messiah, but we'll see. If you're interested, Jimmy Dunn, Parting of the Ways, very interesting. I couldn't find it electronically for you, but it's not required reading. It's just, if that's the sort of thing you want to follow up, there it is. This is our agenda for today. Give you a chance to flick through. Got some comparison with what we did last week. And this time in the third section with Mark, I looked at how Peter is represented in discipleship. This time I'm going to look at, among other things, Torah observance and the gospel. Who wrote it? Matthew, obviously, we might say. External tradition say it was one of the 12, Matthew. On this time, whereas with Mark we said, yeah, that might well be true. This time we say what the early traditions offer us is most unlikely. Traditions aren't always right about these matters. Again, as Eusebius is quoting Papias, and you may remember he didn't have a very high opinion of Papias. From this, neither do I. Papias says Matthew put together the sayings of the Lord in the Hebrew language. You get a similar idea in Irenaeus, probably from the same source. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. First thing is what language you're talking about, obviously. By Hebrew, he must mean Aramaic. Jewish language at this period was Aramaic. Hebrew was used for reading scripture. But even then, it's interesting because it means, you know, it's isolating it to a particular audience, Syria and Palestine. However, if it was written in Aramaic and then translated into Greek, which is what we've got, why does 55% of Matthew's text so closely match up with a gospel that was written in Greek? That it just doesn't make any kind of sense that we've got a Greek translation of an original Aramaic. Moreover, if the author of Matthew was an eyewitness himself, why would he rely heavily on someone else's text who wasn't there, namely Mark? I've picked out a passage which is almost word for word in the Greek, just as it is in the English, with the exceptions that I've highlighted. The naming of Matthew rather than Levi could be just as a different given name. The other changes are minuscule. But more importantly than that, who having been called by Jesus, would tell the story of their call by copying it out from somebody else. You just wouldn't do that, would you? So for a number of reasons, it would be very rare to find a scholar who say, yes, Matthew's Gospel was written by Matthew, one of the 12. That certainly, I think, say it wasn't written in Aramaic, so the tradition isn't accurate, and some of them aren't, and that it's not written by Matthew. Last week we saw that the tradition might well be right, but this time I want to ask a question first. When we say the Gospel according to X, do we mean that X is the author of it, or do we mean that X is the eyewitness behind it? We saw something with Mark's Gospel, that it was accredited to have been, he was a disciple of Peter's. If Mark hadn't been known in the early churches, you can bet your boots that if that tradition was known, people would have said, well, who is this? Where does this gospel come from? Well, Mark was a disciple of Peter. Oh, so it's the gospel according to Peter. It would almost certainly have been called the Gospel according to Peter by tradition if Mark hadn't been a well-known believer to several groups beyond his own community. Now, is that why we've got the ascription to Matthew? Because if the evangelist who wrote this, the writer of it, wasn't a well-known figure, so not like Mark, there would be that impetus to say, well, who does this come from then? Where have we got this from? And if Matthew was associated with that gospel in any way as an eyewitness, that could well be why tradition says this is the gospel according to Matthew. What we have to add to that, of course, is that, just as we said with Mark's gospel, Peter's not the only eyewitness whose material gets into the gospel. Why would it be? And we've certainly got Matthew and others as eyewitness traditions behind this gospel. Well, we've certainly got others. We may well have Matthew, and it looks as if tradition certainly thought so. In Matthew's case, we have to say, and of course there's written sources which aren't just the particular eyewitness of Matthew. We've got Mark, and whatever the double tradition is, the Q tradition, contributing to Matthew's gospel. What does scholarship say then? Pretty strong consensus. Often, with Luke and John, I'm really going to say we really don't know exactly where they were written, but most of us think that it was Antioch in Syria. Poor war-torn Syria, Antioch still where it was, and that it was, as I say, written between 75 to 90, or more narrowly, sort of 78 to 88, that kind of. And that we don't know the name of its writer, of the evangelist. Contribution here from Kingsbury, and it's the Oxford Companion to the Bible. I might have mentioned that in an excerpt last week. In the University of Chester Library, you have access, through the catalogue, you have access to all Oxford reference books. This one's really good, but Oxford Companion to Judaism, Oxford Companion to Christian Ethics, Oxford Companion to Christian Theology, they're all there. So do use a very rich resource if you need, better than Googling these things, see what the scholars are saying. Kingsbury says, Matthew may have helped to found the church in Antioch. It was founded from Jerusalem Church. But the author of this gospel exhibits a theological outlook, command of Greek, and rabbinic training that suggests he was Jewish Christian of the second rather than the first generation. I think you can probably recognize that that's what we call internal evidence. We haven't got any external evidence to say the writer of this gospel was trained by in rabbinic thinking and that his Greek was pretty decent and so forth. We do that from the text itself. More internal evidence then. That conservative approach to the Torah suggests Syria or Palestine. As far as we know, that is where the churches had a particular adherence to the continuity of Judaism within Christian belief. Not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. The fulfillment of Jewish law through God's promises fulfilled in Jesus is what all the church believes, but it led to a conservatism about Torah observance in those churches, certainly through the first century. But the parting of the ways when it happened wasn't a single event, and it may be developing in different ways and at different times. Now, this doesn't come as a shock to you, because I think you know about the Pauline mission, and we must look at that in relation here. We can do a bit more than that. I've said Syria or Palestine, but Palestine is ruled out if this community shows any sign of prosperity because of the decimation of Judea in the Jewish-Roman War. So after 70, the gospel is after 73 and shows any signs of prosperity in its vocabulary. It's Syria, not Palestine. Now, I've only shown you one example of why we make that kind of judgment, but it's quite fun. Mark says, stand up, take your krabatos and go to your home. Matthew says, stand up, take your kline and go to your home. Luke says, take your klinidion, a bit more similar to Matthew. Matthew's and Luke's vocabulary suggests posher kinds of mattresses than Mark does. Mark says yamat, rolled out. They all, it was fairly typical that that beds were rolled out onto shelves or the floor in houses, but you could almost translate Matthew's as mattress. It's a jolly sight more comfortable. It's a bit like when I was younger, you were supposed to be able to tell how posh people were by what they called, what we now all call sofas. Sofa was posh, settee was kind of middle class, and couch was what other people called your sofa. It's that kind of notion of where that vocabulary belongs. Now we're all terribly posh because the people who market sofas want us to feel good about ourselves. Community has strong Jewish identity, internal evidence, and end of the gospel, and mission to include the Gentiles. And Antioch had a large Jewish population and was the site of the earliest Gentile missions. According to Acts, we have things like Barnabas and Paul being sent out to Cyprus and Pamphylia, Cilicia, nearby. Of course, the Great Commission at the end of Matthew, go and make disciples of all nations. Antioch fits. It's where we talk about the sort of the match between internal evidence and external evidence. Antioch was Greek speaking, it was urban, it was prosperous, and had a large population of Jews and Gentiles. I've tried to highlight where a map of the ancient city of Antioch, created through archaeology, shows where the Jewish community resided in this prosperous city. And important internal evidence for us, the Matthew's community see the Pharisees as their main opposition. There's a dating element here. Pharisees have prominence in Matthew and Luke in particular as the opposition to Jesus and consequently to his followers. I mentioned the Pharisees are the renewal party, renewing observance of Torah. Sadducees, different kettle of fish altogether. The Pharisees weren't specially appointed officials. The Sadducees were. They're an aristocratic dynasty who govern the temple as priests, and high priests are always drawn from that lineage. And they are collaborating with Rome. Most scribes as Pharisees, and the Pharisees were opposed to the Romans and their occupation, and to some degree wanted a separatism from the Romans. After 70 CE, the temple authorities, the Sadducees, no longer govern anything in Judaism because the temple is not there. So the party that taught Torah observance is the dominating influence in the synagogues. Torah trumps temple when the temple no longer exists. And consequently, we have sayings of Jesus like this preserved by Matthew and put in this way in Matthew. Jesus says, it's not what comes out of the mouth, what goes into the mouth that defiles. But the disciples say, don't you know the Pharisees took offense when they heard what you said? As the Pharisees would take offense in Antioch when they heard that this was a teaching in Matthew's community. And Matthew repeats that Jesus says they're blind guides. Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. In other words, this is not from God. What we might have, and I said tentatively, is that there could be a synagogue or synagogues led by Jews who believed Jesus was Messiah in Antioch, as well as synagogues led by the much more dominant influence in Syrian Judaism, led by the Pharisees. Other scholars will argue that they have left the synagogues. We really don't know. But look at this fascinating redaction. Mark says, you will be beaten in synagogues. Matthew says, they will flog you in their synagogues. Now, most scholars, I have to confess, don't think what I think. They think, oh, that means that Matthew is distanced from synagogues, so saying their synagogues, we have nothing to do with the synagogues. I think it could mean, well, that's not going to happen in our synagogues. That's what's going to happen in their synagogues. Can you see that distinction? Whether or not that's the case, it is important to recognize that the anti-Semitism that comes out of people's reading of the New Testament, a misreading of the New Testament, in the New Testament, it can't be anti-Semitism because it's these passages are where Jews who believe Jesus is Messiah are countering other Jews. It's an in-house row when we encounter these matters. Really important, but beyond the scope of what we're doing today. What else can we do with the internal evidence matching with any kind of external evidence and saying, are we in the right area of understanding the context from which this gospel comes? Peter had an important status in Antioch, according to Acts. He is one of the first missioners there. He's said to be the first overseer. That's how we should probably translate that word episkopos within Acts and Paul. Later, it's translated as bishop and gets a particular kind of status. Now we know Peter has an important status in Matthew. Do you remember that Mark doesn't have that sort of exaltation of Peter in that commission? Whereas Matthew has, you are Peter, on this rock I'll build my church. You have the keys of the kingdom. If you're interested in this kind of argument, there's a really good website for all sorts of things like this, which actually gives you the documents that these arguments come from. Early Christian writings, open access, a really useful resource. The translations are usually old because they're out of copyright, but that's okay. This kind of argument, not terribly strong on its own, but it's all about fitting a pattern often with these arguments. However, there's one little piece which is gorgeous, and although it's a curious little detail, I will give it to you. In Matthew, Jesus' disciples asked, does your teacher not pay? And in Matthew, it's the didrachma. And the NRSV has translated temple tax because he referred to the temple tax as the 2 drachmas, the double drachma. That's it's kind of a shorthand or an equivalent. And Jesus says, go catch a fish. When you open its mouth, you will find a stater or stater. Now, stater was a coin which in different city-states was of different value. So, and I don't know exactly what they were in different places, could look it up, but you know, maybe in Alexandria it was 3 drachmas, maybe in Athens it was 4, and so on. Only in Antioch was the official stater a double drachma. So Matthew's verses only really make perfect sense in Antioch, because it reads, doesn't your teacher pay the 2 drachmas? And Jesus says, go catch a fish, you'll find there's a 2 drachmas. It's as neat as that. It doesn't prove anything, but is an interesting pointer. Like I say, I don't think you necessarily need that for your sermons or your essays, but I thought you'd find it interesting. We ask all these questions: who wrote it? When did they write it? For whom? Because we're interested in why do they write it. That's what we want to get at. What's Matthew banging on about? And to understand its context may help us with that. The kind of I'm doing the resource bit here rather than right at the end because it's relevant to this. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I've named 3 commentaries, which are all very good in different ways. Craig Keener's, Jack Kingsbury's. You can see from Andrew Overman's title, Matthew's Gospel and Formative Judaism, the social world of Matthew's community, that the emphasis is this kind of context. I'm sorry I could only find those in hard copy for those of you who can actually access physically the library. So obviously I looked for e-resources as well. Some good news there. Through the university catalogue, you've got a really good commentary, Howard Clark, and you can see it's got that focus on historical questions, which is what you need for this sort of analysis. You can see he's about to say historical introduction to the first gospel. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea that first there means in the canon. It doesn't mean chronologically. We often, it's just no particular reason. A lot of people refer to John's gospel as the 4th gospel. It happens to be 4th in the canon and 4th chronologically, so that one's less confusing. I've listed to something I found, Simple Guide to Matthew. Listed it partly because, can you see in the brief blurb, it talks about how readers can relate to the material. So I imagine that's the kind of thing that might help if you're preaching on Matthew anytime soon. I looked at the hub as well. Nothing in the line of commentary on that, I'm afraid, apart from Digest of Theology, which I talked about, the 4 short books, which we looked at last week. And again, last week we saw that the Oxford Bible Commentary. The section on Matthew is Dale Allison, and we'll deal with all the important issues, even though obviously it's a shorter commentary than a full published book. And just a reminder that the Oxford Companion is there too. I use it for something Jack Kingsbury said about Gospel according to Matthew, and there is a section in the Oxford Companion on each, a very brief section, summative, on each of the books of the Bible. But what it's really good for, I'd go to the Oxford Bible Commentary if I wanted more detail on the books, but it's things like Pharisees, Torah, James the brother of Jesus. I remember somebody once asked me about angels, and I thought, what are angels? And it's a brilliant book for that kind of thing. We'll tell you where they are in the Old Testament, what they do, and how things change over time, perhaps, and how they're viewed in the New Testament. So, strong recommendation there for Oxford Companion as well as Oxford Bible Commentary, both available to you online. Now, I suggested some things that you might think about. Is there a structure that you get a sense of in Matthew's narrative? Are there things that are repeated or recur as motifs? Interested in how you think each gospel writer presents Jesus. What kind of portrait of Jesus is this? And related to all of those things, really, what's the theology here? What are the theological themes of the gospel? So I'd like to come out of stop share. That's the one. And if you'd like to unmute, we'll have a chat. So I can either ask individual. Is it okay to everybody unmute, or is that a nightmare? You've got more experience than that. Is it going to be too echoey? If you choose to just unmute when you want to speak, up to you. You know better than I how to handle this. Who would like to say something about their reading of Matthew's Gospel and anything about those structure, repeated motifs, theology, what Jesus is like, or how it differs from Mark?
I think the constant backing up of what is being said with reference to as it was written and, as it has been said. And so there's constant reference to previous scripture, isn't there?
Absolutely. All the gospel writers refer to the Old Testament as the place of the promises which are being fulfilled. Matthew has a particularly scriptural, he acknowledges sources, doesn't he? He even corrects some of Mark's. If Mark says it's from the prophet Isaiah, and Matthew can see it's actually got a bit of Malachi and a bit of Isaiah, he says from the prophets. He's tidying up a bit. Yes, as it's written. Arguably, John's Gospel is even more stuffed with reference to the Old Testament than Matthew is, but he doesn't say as it is written. He just uses the same image. Just uses an Old Testament. It's kind of much more elusive, whereas Matthew is a quoter, isn't he? Good, very, very good, very good. Other features or ideas?
The pattern that you pointed out last week in Mark, the 3 times the predicting of his death and resurrection, is also in Matthew. I've never spotted these ever. And having seen
my work is done.
The next.
Good. Yeah. Matthew is conservative in his treatment of his material. He basically follows Mark's order. He puts lots of other things in, but that you could almost take out everything from Matthew that isn't in Mark, and you've still got Mark in the right order. That won't happen in Luke at all. I'll show you the different things. So a conservative treatment. Really interesting that he, as it were, honors Mark in that way. He wants to base, he uses almost everything of Mark, as if not to leave anything out. His changes are interesting when he makes them, because he clearly doesn't make them randomly. They're quite, so it's worth sometimes looking at why has he changed that word. With something like the mattress, I think it's just because that's his word for it. There are some things which are just stylistic, and that we shouldn't make too much heavy weather of, like Kingdom of God, Kingdom of Heaven, and so on. Excellent. Anything else from anybody?
I just asked then what you were saying about him being, and you're right. It is. You can see Mark woven through to it. But does that link? Because if Mark is meant to have Peter as the eyewitness, and Antioch thought very highly of Peter, does that mean that it raises Mark's gospel in status?
It's interesting, isn't it? It doesn't mean that the status is so high that Matthew's not prepared to change things. He hasn't just repeated Mark's gospel saying this is the gospel of Peter. He has used it, but he has added to it and occasionally made some quite, well, he obviously differs from what he thinks well, I'm thinking particularly of thus he declared all things clean. He leaves that out because he doesn't think that Jesus declared all things clean. So there's that. But then maybe he thought, well, that wouldn't have been what Peter said. That's Mark. I don't know. That's the kind of thing that we speculate about in these matters. But, you know, try not to build too many castles on sand either, and stay open to the possibilities. And for sermons, grab the thing that's most useful. You know, if something occurs that actually would help, then we can use them and say, perhaps this means that. I think you can use all the ifs and buts and not sures in scholarship in a sermon. You just drop the ones that that aren't going to help you focus on what you need to convey in your context. I wonder, do any of you sympathise with a mature student of mine of some years ago, who was a lay reader and had been for years, so, you know, faithful Christian and quite good on reading the scriptures, evangelical tradition. But I did for them what I've asked you to do, which is, will you read the whole of the gospel at once? And he'd never done that to Matthew. So he came into the room and I said, have you done your homework? And he said, what? And I said, have you read Matthew's gospel? And he said, yes. And I didn't like it. There was a kind of and it was really quite surprised. Anybody have any kind of antipathy and sort of thought, what sort of voice have we got here? What sort of...
I have to be honest, can I just say that the Matthew thing, I'm dreadful at sitting and reading. So I did it in the audio version. And I found it quite upsetting, emotional, really quite emotional, especially towards the end. And obviously I've read it before, and obviously like everybody else, I preached Mark, as I mentioned, this weekend twice for a 9 o'clock and a 10:30. But the Matthew, hearing it like that, and obviously you're more focused on it because we're looking at it seriously, I found it really quite emotional, I must be honest, because it's much more dramatic, for me anyway, than Mark was. And I just was quite almost teary towards the end. I was getting myself quite teared up about it, you know, because the feelings towards what was happening to Jesus. And I just, as I say, pretty much just very straightforward fashion, I was very emotional about it.
Really interesting, because I think it was completely the other way around for me.
Oh, is that funny? Yeah.
I found Mark much more dramatic, and I could see the pictures much more clearly in Mark.
No, I can't. It's strange, isn't it, how we perceive things? And I just found Matthew more theatrical, I suppose, is the word I've written down.
It's the way David Suchet read it, I reckon.
Is that what it is? But I also heard it, and I heard there's another version out there as well that was interesting, but very American, some of them, and I'm not so sure about the American ones.
I'm not so sure about David Suchet, but that's
okay.
Have they made you do Myers-Briggs at all on personality types, or have you come across Myers-Briggs?
Yeah.
Not important, as just as some of you might recognize the preferences that we have between things that are open-ended or closed, P and J in Myers-Briggs. I think Matthew likes to settle and close things. That's to say, things that Mark leaves open, even at the end of the gospel, you know, the reader has to respond to. Matthew makes sure you know what it means. It kind of completes, and I think some of us are kind of need that completion, and others of us like that kind of openness. And I think sometimes that's why the different gospels appeal to different sort of temperaments and so forth, and so on. Anybody else struggle with the weeping and wailing and gnashing teeth? As Matthew is quite big on Gehenna or hell.
It's quite judgy. He feels really judgy dog about this, you know.
Well, we can't be believers in God and not. I mean, God is judge. That is absolutely, you know, the role. He made it and he brings it to an end, and that means, you know, he is judge over all. And Jesus has part of that, and so on. But he does go in for the kind of, well, like I say, that particular phrase, the weeping and the wailing and the gnashing of teeth, is repeated phrase, and it's only in Matthew. You know, it's a very particular way of thinking about. Maybe it's part of his close-ended. You know, he likes to have things clearly wrapped up and defined in some way. I don't know.
I don't know if it's just me, but I felt that there was this very much more of this image of Jesus as being first and foremost Jewish. I don't know whether I've picked up the wrong end of the stick there, but I just felt that that came across very much, that Matthew wanted to kind of really emphasize the fact that although Jesus had come for the Gentiles as well, that he first and foremost was, you know, was from a Jewish tradition.
Excuse me.
And I don't know whether that's to do with the time of writing.
Well,
or something.
no, it's the whole of the New Testament in a sense. The mission to the Jews is first. It comes from the Jews. Paul says this is from the Jews, the prophets, the covenant, and indeed the Messiah. You know, that's absolutely grounded, and it doesn't stop being that.
But it felt reading it in, you know, across one go, more or less. That just kept feeling like it was much more recurring than it had been.
It's structural, isn't it?
Yes.
I'll show you one of the commentators who says what you've got is after the initial presentation to Jesus, you've got the presentation of the gospel to Israel, God's people, and then there's the repudiation by Israel of the gospel, and then you have the Jerusalem section. I think Matthew has made it structural. It's there in all the others. The oddity, the standout one, is John, who refers to other people as the Jews. He has things like Jesus and the disciples were approached by the Jews, and you think, what you're talking about? That they are Jews. You know, that's an extraordinary distancing at the end of the first century. But there is, I think, we have a problem which the first context didn't have. I think we've forgotten how completely Jewish the New Testament is, how completely Jewish Jesus is, and all of the first followers, and quite possibly all of the New Testament writers. Luke might be Gentile, but he could well be Jewish. You know, there's it's a much more Jewish book than, and it's Jewish theology that we need. It's Jewish theology that Paul works with, as I'll touch on in a few weeks' time, maybe. So thank you. That's certainly the case. Anything more about Jesus or anything else?
Well, I thought that Jesus in Matthew seemed to be a softer character than, or more fluffy, whatever word you want to say, than he seemed quite cross a lot of, especially with the disciples a lot of the time in Mark. He was always telling them off and giving them up. But in Matthew, he seemed to be more benevolent, a little bit more sort of patient, a little bit more understanding somehow to me.
It's a really important theme, isn't it, in Mark? Do you not yet understand something they're not seeing? And part of that is literary, isn't it? It's getting the reader to see, do you see there is something here to understand? You know, but you're absolutely right. It's a very particular impatience that keeps coming up as a repeated thing. And Matthew doesn't have that, partly because he doesn't seem to be prepared to show the disciples up in such a poor light. I mean, he repeats the stuff from, the rebuke to Peter and the denial, Peter's denial. He has all that as well. But he changes some things too. As we saw last week, didn't we? That there's he doesn't say, and they didn't know what to say because they were terrified. Just doesn't comment in that way.
Yes, I had that one on Sunday as well. I found it interesting because I was looking at Mark, that the bit where Peter says, "You are the Messiah," and I was waiting for the rest of it, and it's not there. But it's there in Matthew, where he says, "You are Peter, and on this rock," and so on. But no, there's a great big gap in Mark's version. It just sort of, doesn't happen.
It's a gap if you're expecting it.
Yeah.
If you're not expecting it makes rather more sense, because you know, he immediately goes on to say, when you say I'm the Messiah, the Son of Man will suffer, and Peter says, no, that's not what I meant.
Yeah.
Do you see? It's got a kind of a narrative flow in Mark,
Yeah.
which in a way Matthew's putting in material from somewhere has slightly interrupted. So it kind of depends what you're expecting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's what I meant.
I say that. I mean, Matthew's gospel has had quite a priority in a lot of Christian thinking. So for centuries, it's the Augustinian sort of approach really and beyond, people thought they were written in the order in which they come in the canon, and that each of the gospels had access to the one before them, the ones before them. So Mark knew Matthew, Luke knew Mark and Matthew, John knew all three. We really don't think that now, but it's partly what gives Matthew such a sort of priority, why people know some of the stories from Matthew. And certainly his exaltation of Peter is quite important in the formation of the church, which is based on Rome. And he was one of the overseers in Rome, first pope, etc. So that's been an important part of how we've received Matthew. The one area in which people don't remember Matthew over the others is when it comes to the parables. When he's got the same parables as Luke and Matthew, people remember the Lucan ones. There's something about Luke's storytelling, which we'll look at next time, or I think our 5th week. Good stuff. Anything else that we could share about Matthew's portrait of Jesus, or our responses to the teaching in this gospel?
I think there was something as well, I don't know again whether it's just me picking up on it, but this idea of remaining faithful in the face of adversity. You know, there was something that I should have written it down, shouldn't I? And I've just written the sentence down, but something about, you know, when it's, you have, that Jesus saying about you need to kind of maintain the faith even when things are really hard. I should have written it down.
Really important for us in thinking about, you know, what's good to preach from. But can you see that is almost certainly something that Matthew is needing to say to his context? Needs to reinforce the teaching of Jesus to see how they can be faithful to Jesus in their setting. So we'll look at that in our next half as well too. Thank you. That's great.
Something that I know. Sorry, Helen, go first.
Helen.
There was something I was just flicking through actually to see where I could find it. It was in the John Cook book. Matthew removes potentially embarrassing details about the human nature of Jesus. 3 examples of absence are in conflict with the Pharisees. Jesus heals a man apparently because he is angry with his opponents. Jesus's family want to restrain Jesus because they fear that he is mad. That's in Mark. And when a woman reaches out to Jesus and is healed, Jesus asks who touched him. It's highly unlikely that a later writer would have wanted to make Jesus out to be more emotional, mad, or ignorant. I found that really interesting.
It is, and he might be right. I actually don't agree with Cook on that, because I don't think Matthew would have needed to think in terms of Jesus' human nature and divine nature. That's very creedal language. That's the way we think enormously. We have, you know, we've learned about these. The full humanity, full divinity of Jesus, that's kind of important. I don't think they would have questioned for a moment that Jesus was fully human. They wouldn't have crossed their minds that he wasn't fully human. That's sort of something we had to wrestle with, you know, when we thought, well, if he's God, then how do, you know, that whole language comes later. I think some of the, you're absolutely right. He doesn't want, I think there could be different interpretations of each of those differences and the parts he leaves out, which aren't just about Jesus' humanity. For instance, I think the issue of leaving out people calling him mad is because he doesn't want to say that Jesus' mother and brothers thinks Jesus is going off the rocket, because
I was quite shocked when I read that.
Mark seems to say, well, we'll look at it. we'll look at it in the second half, and we'll consider what might be going on there. Mark doesn't mind, kind of, as it were, saying people get things wrong, but it's okay, does he? So that's a different thing. I do think Matthew is more respectful
Yes.
of authorities and and so on. But yeah, I don't think Mark's disrespectful. I just think he thinks there's a message here and to get across.
Yeah,
Nigel,
Mark always
you wanted
seems,
to say-
because
Susan?
Mark is so direct, I just feel like sometimes I think he needed to get it down, and he needed to get the important things down, and he wasn't going to mess about with any flowery bits. He just wanted
Yeah.
to
I can't take offence at Mark either. I think he's got that approach. And Nigel, you wanted to say something earlier, and then we ought to have a break.
Yeah, right. I was going to say, because we were talking about the kind of judgment angle on Matthew, but he seems to. One thing that struck me was about, I think it was chapter 18. You've got temptations to sin, and then you know it talks about the hell of fire, but then he goes on with the parable of the lost sheep, which is somewhat softer. And then you've got the reproving another who sins, and then you've got Peter asking how many times you should forgive. And it sort of seems there's a stern line and the soft line, sort of cheek and jowl.
You may be
with each
right,
other.
but you may
Yeah.
also be importing from what Luke means when he gives the parable of the lost son to what Matthew's using it for.
Yeah.
In Luke, it's very particular addressed at the Pharisees are saying, "Why are you eating with sinners?" And he says, you know, there's joy in heaven over a sinner who repents. The setting that Matthew gives it, the lost sheep, he seems to be saying, be careful how you behave to other people in the church. So, you know, they all use the teaching, the material, the same material, but they actually give it a different setting. And consequently, the meaning can slightly change. I've been looking at what I'll do on Luke, obviously, next week. But we get a second session on Luke because we've got to think about the sermons. I thought what I'm going to do in that fifth session is parables, because I think, you know, they lend themselves to sermons a bit, don't they, too, and thinking about interpreting them. So I thought I will look at that again.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Super stuff, and absolutely spot on in terms of what you're observing, although we might draw different conclusions from the things that you are observing too. We must break, and it's almost 8 o'clock. Tell me again how long you like to have.
Just over 10.
Sorry. What we did mention between us is the teaching. Mark often says Jesus taught them many things, but he even says, feeding of the 5,000, he taught them till the sun went down, but he doesn't tell you what he said. He doesn't give you much. Whereas Matthew has blocked the teaching, taken things that are in different places and collected them in 5 discourses. So I'm going to share my screen again, I think, and do the same thing again. Just settings, duplicate. There we go. That's the agenda again. I want to think about themes and structure, sort of bits of overview, including first of all structure and then the message about Jesus. There are 5 quite long blocks of teaching in Matthew, discourses, and we know that he was consciously arranging things this way, because the last phrase at the end of each one is very, very similar. I've given it to you on the right hand side. When Jesus had finished saying these things, is what we get after the Sermon on the Mount. Slightly different after the next discourse, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, because these discourses are 2 different people about different things. The Sermon on the Mount about discipleship is to the crowds and his disciples together. Then the missionary discourse is to the 12 and the sending out of the 12. The next one, parables, that's to the crowds, because everybody gets parables, only the disciples get the inner teaching. When Jesus had finished these parables, comes at the end. Then in chapter 18, you have the disciples asking him, Jesus discoursing on, and really it's the nature of the church. Matthew uses the word church twice, which is odd in some ways. It makes sense to his first readers. It wouldn't necessarily have made absolute sense to the disciples. So he's using a word that makes sense in his context. And exactly the same phrase as ends the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus had finished saying these things. The fifth discourse is eschatological. He has distinguished between different types of material which Mark has mingled. Mark is perfectly capable of putting eschatological stuff right next to discipleship stuff about how they should behave in their lives, because for Mark the end of the world is such a soon event, such an imminent event. Matthew keeps them apart in this way. So what I'm suggesting to you is that he has a tidy mind. He has collated the teaching from his sources thematically here. Some people say, the structure clearly tells us that there are 5 books, and we know that the Old Testament has, there's 5 books of the law, the Pentateuch. And this is quite a frequently peddled theory. It's simply not convincing. I mean, it's lovely to find that kind of neatness, but it doesn't really mean anything. What would Matthew mean by doing that? What we are getting from Matthew, as well as this tidiness, is a deliberate focus on Jesus as teacher, which I would like to develop with you. Rather than 5 books, I would commend to you this sort of diagram, which came to my mind when one of you, sorry, I still don't know your names well, talked about the Jewishness of the gospel and the fact that this ministry is to Israel, and then we have Israel's repudiation of Jesus. It shows how the 5 discourses fit into that pattern. And I think that doesn't strain things at all and gives a helpful clarity to where we are in the movement of the narrative and in Matthew's message. Commentaries that do that sort of shaping for you, I think, are extremely helpful, although of course they can all do it in different ways. I'm distrustful of the ones who have a very sort of complicated pattern. This one is just about nice and simple and clear. I'll show you some complicated ones when we get to John's Gospel. From that structure, I'd like to move and the emphasis and the emphasis on Jesus as teacher. I'd like to look at that message about Jesus. And the digest I'm going to give you bears comparison with Kingsbury's structure, I think. It draws a bit on another commentary I like, Craig Keener's, and he says, and I would emphasize too, that the digest I'm going to give you about Matthew's portrait of Jesus is actually there in Mark. It's just that Matthew has emphasized particular aspects. I'm sure you'll recognize them. Firstly, Matthew holds that Jesus is a teacher with supreme authority. So you have this extraordinary passage. You're not to be called rabbi, you have one teacher. Call no one father, you have one father. You're not to be called instructors, you have one instructor. Perhaps the Pharisees and the other synagogues in Antioch were calling themselves instructors. He is teacher with supreme authority because he is the King Messiah. That is, he is going to be the ruler of Israel, God's people. He will judge the world when God's promises are fulfilled. And so we have the Son of Man on the throne of his glory and all the nations gathered before him, the seat of judgment and the judge. Jesus as eschatological judge. Just to shunt those up a bit so I got more room. Teacher with supreme authority, King Messiah who will judge the world. Then there is a threat to Jesus coming from the religious leadership more than from the people. And again, one of you in our discussion talked about, you know, the danger that's being faced in the end part of the gospel. His followers face the same persecution that Jesus faces. You'll recognize that from Mark as well. The religious leadership comes into bigger focus in Matthew. And maybe that's because his own readers, or the members of his own context, his congregation, are facing that kind of persecution from religious leadership too. So we've got a match between the material he's using from Jesus' encounter with religious leadership to what his own community is facing, as we've looked in Antioch. Matthew's focus, of course, is on what's particularly relevant to them. And in Antioch, the leaders of the synagogues led by the Pharisees are in contention with the Christian communities who might be synagogues of Jews who believe Jesus is Messiah, also including Gentiles among them. So if they are persecuted in this way, what Matthew is doing, his sort of purpose in writing the gospel, is to equip them. And the elements of that equipping believers to face that difficulty is fascinating. It is, first of all, radical discipleship. Mark has a call to radical discipleship, take up your cross. Matthew's is your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. So the adherence to God's covenant and God's law is the way they will be strong in the face of the opposition. And secondly, and to me this comes as more surprisingly because of Matthew's conservatism, sort of general status quo preservation, is he's so radical about possessions. You cannot serve God on wealth. Don't worry about life or your food. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. He takes that radicalism of Jesus and thinks this is clearly an important message, right in the heart of the Sermon on the Mount, a message for his community. And if that's one way to equip them, the second way is to look beyond Israel. Israel is gathered in as part of God's people, but there is another mission to be completed before King Messiah rules. And I'm sure you know the ending of the gospel well. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations. All peoples, that is, in Greek, or races or nations. So you have Jews think of themselves, they are the people of God, and then there are the other peoples. And through Latin, we make that the Gentiles, the gens, the people, the other peoples. Here we have all nations, peoples, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. So it's about the teaching of Jesus again. And look at what the last phrase is. I am with you to the end of the age. That is Jesus in his eschatological role. So can you see how that final mission repeats and endorses that idea of Jesus as teacher, Jesus as eschatological judge? These are all of the gospel writers are exceptionally competent writers in the way they, have at the end something which has been adumbrated at the beginning. It's a beautiful inclusio, it's called in rhetoric. That, I think, is I find it a very helpful digest from mostly there from Craig Keener, a bit of me in it, which helps one to see what Matthew thinks is Jesus' message to his community. It may well be for ours too. In our final movement, I want to look at redaction, which is something we've talked about in relation to all of the Gospels, especially where they're different and where the Gospel communities each reflect different strands of a tradition, maybe. So I want to take this question of, should Christians be Torah observant? And especially, should Gentile Christians be Torah observant? There isn't the same problem about Jewish Christians being Torah observant. And I'm going to start with my timeline again, if that's okay. Paul in Galatians says, I said to Cephas before them all. Cephas is Peter. Paul always calls him by his Aramaic name. Cephas means rock, and that gets translated into Greek as Petros, which is why we call him Peter. But he was Cephas to any Aramaic speaker. And I know a lot of English people would say Cephas there, and that's fine, you can if you like, but the Greek is a K, Cephas. So Paul says to Peter, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? And this is about what happened in Antioch in terms of table fellowship. I'll look at that passage in a second. Before I do, that's in about 49-ish. In about 117, Ignatius writes a letter, Bishop Ignatius, to the Philadelphians. So it's right at the end of the New Testament period, from right at the beginning of one of our earliest New Testament documents. And he says, if anyone propounded Judaism to you, do not listen to them. What does he mean by propounding Judaism? He means what Paul means, Judaizing, compelling the Gentiles to live like Jews. So in 49 and in 117, the same issue, the same tension between what should we do about the law is in some places still prevalent. It wasn't settled by the Pauline mission everywhere and for everyone. The Pauline mission is enormous in terms of geography, but don't let, as it were, the geographical sign confuse you into thinking that it's a much bigger operation than the Jerusalem church. The Jerusalem church probably had churches at that same period of nexus of churches, which could amount to some thousands of people. What you've got in Paul's house churches, in any one house church, maximum of about 40 or 50 people. So a much more scattered urban phenomenon. The Jerusalem church is led first by, first by Peter and John, son of Zebedee, but very quickly by James, the brother of the Lord, who we must definitely look at. And they are in Judea and Syria, and they are mostly Jews. Just geographically, they are mostly Jews. This is the way that Luke puts an incident that happened in Antioch. Certain individuals came down from the Jerusalem church to Antioch, and they were teaching the brothers. Usually I would query why the NRSV says brothers. They would say brothers and sisters, but here we're talking about circumcision. So he's talking about the male believers. Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So there's a Jerusalem church contingent coming down and saying to Gentile Christians in Antioch, you need to follow all the conventions of Torah. And Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them. And it meant, because it was unresolved, that Paul and Barnabas are appointed, Luke says, to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this and get it sorted with the apostles there. We think when Paul talks about something in Galatians, he's talking about the same event. Just a bit differently. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. So we've got Peter is already in Antioch, but then certain people came from James. So he identifies the contingent from the Jerusalem church as being sent by James, the brother of the Lord, And it's from James that you get the message that they shouldn't eat with the Gentiles to keep the separation as the Torah prescribed. And after they came, Peter drew back and kept himself separate for fear of those who said, unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses. So it's not resolved for Peter at this time. And for James is really clear. Gentile Christian males should be circumcised. Other Jews joined him in Paul's words, this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel. Luke says there was a discussion and debate. Paul says, I saw they were wrong. He does have a different approach, a different view. Luke is a pacifier. So what happens? They meet with the apostles, and we think this is the Council of Jerusalem, roughly around 49, 50, 51. I mention, just for the sake of accuracy, we're not absolutely sure about the dates because Galatians seems to suggest that that row in Antioch postdates this debate in Jerusalem, but they look awfully similar. So my advice is don't worry too much about the dates. Both of these happened at a similar time. So we're back in Acts, and Paul and Barnabas come to Jerusalem. They were welcomed by the church and the apostles, but some believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees, I thought I'd just underline that for you to remind you there are believers in Jesus as Messiah, Jewish believers of Jesus as Messiah, who were Pharisees. Not all of the Pharisees are sort of in absolute opposition, but they're taking a line which certainly Paul would disagree with, but not James. It's necessary for Gentiles to be circumcised in order to keep the law of Moses, Judaizing, Torah observance among Gentile Christians. And the apostles and elders met together, much debate, and Peter speaks. We'll be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus, just as the Gentiles will. And Barnabas and Paul spoke. Now, verse 13, after they finished speaking, James replied, listen to me, I have reached the decision. One of the things I want you to notice there is that James is speaking, and Luke presumably thinks rightly, as having the authority in that council. He's not saying, you know, let us all agree. He said, I have decided. And he's effectively changed his mind. We should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but they should obey certain things within the covenant. Again, I'm going to put the text of Galatians next to it. Same event, I think. Went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas. I laid before them, though only in a private meeting with the acknowledged leaders, the gospel. That's why people are not quite sure it's the same event. Luke makes it more public. The gospel that I proclaimed among the Gentiles. He calls the believers false believers. They've got, you know, they've got it wrong. But look at this, verse 6. Peter and James speak in Luke, and what Paul says is, from those who are supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. He really is saying, well, Peter and James may be leading the church in Jerusalem, but I get my authority from Christ, and that's the goings on in the church in Jerusalem are not going to affect the way I conduct my ministry or how I understand the truth. If in your ministry you ever find the authority of church leaders, archdeacons or bishops at all oppressive, just read Galatians. Say to yourself, God shows no partiality. It's quite a radical response. Now, one of the things that we might say is, where on earth has James come from? We must look at that as well. Yeah. We've got the possibility then that right through the New Testament period, and certainly across the time of the Gospels, we've got this question about should Christians be Torah observant? It should have been resolved at that council. Was everybody as clear about exactly how it functioned? And alongside it were the Jerusalem leaders of the early church, Peter and James, recognized as authorities. Now, by the time of the Gospels, they were dead. Both Peter and James are killed in the early 60s. So Mark is a few years later, fresh memories surely of that Jerusalem church, and a bit further in history for Matthew and Luke, quite a long way away by the time we get to John. Think about these questions. I'm doing the Throckmorton thing again, and you remember we can see them in parallel in that very helpful book, or you can find the parallels on the website that I showed you, 5 Gospel Parallels. In Mark, in terms of the Sabbath laws, Torah observance, Mark says that the opposition in the synagogue watch him. It doesn't mention Pharisees. Watch him to see if he'd heal him on the Sabbath. And he does. And he says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good? It's not a very complicated question about Torah. Isn't it the right thing to do good? Matthew has Mark's narrative. You can see that it stops from being they looking at him and Jesus asking at the end, is it lawful on the Sabbath? The authorities in the synagogue ask him, is it lawful? Is it within Torah to heal on the Sabbath? And he argues from an application of the law. This is a very kind of rabbinical thing. You say, well, take this case study in law. That's okay. And so it is lawful to do God on the Sabbath. If you can take a sheep out that falls into a pit, you can heal a man on the Sabbath. Matthew effectively says, Jesus doesn't break the law by doing this. He's not being careless of the law at all. The application of the law that Matthew puts there, we know he gets from somewhere else because Luke got it in a different place. Luke follows Mark fairly closely. Luke's not terribly interested in the law. It's too far back for him, really. He's not sort of concerned with that whole Judaizing problem. But Matthew takes a saying which Luke has elsewhere in chapter 40, not in chapter 6, and has sees it as an application. There is then the discussion in chapter 7 of Mark, where the Pharisees and scribes ask, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. Again, nothing to do with hygiene, everything to do with kosher regulation. And we can see Matthew and Mark in parallel. I've just reminded you, I'll try to stop doing this eventually, but the RSV is wrong. That isn't a man, it's anthropos, not andros. So it's a person. The Bible is slightly less sexist than people imagine. What you see there is, as one of you expressed it, Mark's left something out. Not quite that, it's that Matthew has chosen to include something that wasn't in Mark. I'll make it a bit bigger. We've seen it before when I was talking about Antioch. I think, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying about what goes into the mouth, what comes out of the mouth? And they are blind guides. This is redaction of Matthew, putting in a teaching from another source because that matches his context in Syria after 70 CE. They both have the same core message that what comes from within, from out of the heart, is what defiles a person. They both do that, but they then do something quite different. Mark says, thus he declared all food clean. Matthew says, to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a person. So for Matthew, the takeaway meaning of the teaching in this passage and this incident is not that all foods are kosher, but that it's eating with unwashed hands is not defiling to a person. You can keep Torah, and that they weren't breaking Torah when he did that. That's a very different editorializing of the same teaching, of the same passage. And we shouldn't draw a conclusion from a single passage, but it's when you put the parts together and you put it together with things like Matthew 5, that we begin to see what may be the ethos in Matthew's community. Summarize, and a bit too brief and a bit too broad brush, but Matthew's is still a very Jewish community of Jews who believe Jesus is Messiah. It includes Gentiles too. It's probably a bit more like the early Jerusalem church. Mark's community, I would say, seems more Pauline in its theology and its character. If he was a follower of Peter, he certainly has got the flavour of Paul's teaching in his gospel. I think for Luke, it's not so much either. He's neither pro-Paul or pro-Peter. Well, he's both pro-Paul and pro-Peter because he's a nice guy. But I think the arguments about Torah are kind of historical ones for him and not relevant to his community. Kath mentioned last week, what about Cornelius in Acts? And although it's kind of slightly out of our focus on the Gospels, I feel I should just take a short excursus to note it. I'm sure you know it, do you? Peter has a vision or a dream and sees a sheep coming down from heaven full of animals and God saying, kill and eat. And he says, I don't eat unclean things, unkosher things. And the reply is that what God has made clean, you must not call profane. Deeply puzzled, and he's then awoken by people knocking on the door, sent by a Gentile. And Peter later addresses them and says, you know, it's unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile. So he's still keeping very separatist habits. This is after the resurrection. And he says, God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So a huge moment in the Gentile inclusion. The watershed seems to have been inclusion of the Gentiles for the Jerusalem church. Somebody's got their mic on and we've got some background noise. Can anybody mute who's not muted? I don't normally say that, but thanks. So Mark's interpretation of what Jesus meant can't have been understood in the same way by all the disciples at that time. Indeed, I think we have to say Jesus might have been pretty conservative about Torah observance because he was working among Jews. There are a few moments of Gentile inclusion in the Gospels, not many. And maybe, you know, that whole ethos is much more Jewish than the church later becomes. Well, it is much more Jewish than the church later becomes. I wonder if I can then just help you by thinking about Paul, just to fill in what's going on, because Paul's argument for Gentile believers not keeping Torah doesn't depend on teaching of Jesus. Paul doesn't have much of the sayings of Jesus. He doesn't have the Gospels, and we don't really know how much he had of the traditions that lie behind them. Paul's argument for Gentile believers not keeping Torah depends on the theology of the cross. Salvation is through Christ, not through Torah. And the law is good. Torah observance among Christian Jews continued. He was pretty Torah observant, but you certainly don't compel the Gentiles to live like Jews because it alters the basis of salvation. The problem comes when unity of Christ among believers, and especially table fellowship, means that you're, as it were, infringing on regulations of Torah. And for Paul, unity in Christ trumps that distinction between them, although he himself was very largely Torah observant, and many of the Jews were through the first century. This is where, you know, that parting of the ways becomes a question, and when does this happen? Alongside that, it's useful to say, so what is their allegiance to the tradition of James and Peter and the Jerusalem church, which was slow to change to this Gentile inclusion and the non-observance of Torah by Gentile Christians? How does that work? Well, we know about Peter in Matthew's Gospel having a much more protected or exalted or celebrated role than Mark chooses to give him. Mark tells the story about how Peter didn't at first get things right. So I'm going to shift from Peter to James and say, what treatment does the brother of Jesus or the family of Jesus get in our Gospels? I don't know if you are surprised in Acts 9 to find James leading the church in Jerusalem, when in the Gospels you'd barely have noticed that he was there, and when he was there,
Roberts.
wasn't. Nigel? Sorry?
It's not. It might just be advisable. That's not Acts 9. That's Acts 15.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's me thinking about Paul and the Damascus Road experience. You know. Yeah. Thank you very much. Gosh, well done. How well do you know this? There are two places, one in 1 Corinthians, one in Acts, where we have, as it were, the clues to what happens. We hear that Jesus appeared to James after the 11 rather than the 12, and then 500 brothers and sisters. He appeared to James, then to all the apostles. That means, by the way, that that Paul gives the name apostle to people other than the 12. The 12 are the 12, and they are apostles, but others are also apostles, including, I think he means there James is one of those who is sent. Apart from that, we have one verse in Acts that after the ascension, the 11 come back, constantly devoting themselves to prayer with women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. And then until, as Nigel rightly says, chapter 15, somewhere between that, James becomes the most important figure in the church, so that he can say, listen to me, I have made the decision. Much more authoritarian than Paul ever is in some ways, although we must discuss that when we get to Paul. Paul is bossy, no question about that. Here is a passage in Mark that we started talking about when we were chatting about the gospel, when we talked about the mother and brothers of Jesus having responses to Jesus. First of all, in Nazareth, his hometown, 6:1, he teaches, and people in Nazareth say, he's a local lad, what's going on? He's related to people we know, Mary, James and Joseph, Judas and Simon, his sisters. And Jesus says to them, prophets are not without honor, except, so they don't get honor in their hometown, among their own family. I don't know why the NRSV, well, I do know why the NRSV doesn't say family, because he wants to sort of, they want to slightly distance it from the mother and brothers and sisters, and their own house. But the plain sense of that is that Mark says Jesus was not honored by his family at that stage. And fascinatingly, this is just a few years after the death of James, who had been so influential in the Jerusalem church. Am I sure that that's what he means? Well, Luke and Matthew leave it out, both of them. Can you see Matthew says in their country and their house, and Luke just says in the hometown, doesn't even say their own house, which might include slaves or other people in the household. But neither Matthew nor Luke want to say his family did not accept him. Mark is prepared to say that. Does that mean he has a different attitude to that? Or is he doing what he does with Peter to say, well, they went wrong before, but they did recover? There's the same issue when his family heard about Jesus' teaching. They went out to restrain him for, and this is literal on the Greek, they were saying, and it's what the NRSV says, he has gone out of his mind. Other translations want to say that the they is not the first subject. They went out, his family, for they, other people, for people were saying he's gone out of his mind. It's no question it could mean that, but people reading that wouldn't think So the plain sense is his family are saying, what's going on? We don't recognize this, must be nuts. And then we have the crowd around him, and he's asked, who are my mother? Well, he asked, who are my mother and our brothers, and says, whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Now that doesn't have to be a rejection of them, but again, we look at what Luke and Matthew do. Neither of them includes the phrase that they're out there because they are worried about the state of his mind. They want to speak with him. Luke, bless his heart, there's always a perfectly valid reason. Nobody's doing anything wrong. They couldn't reach him because of the great crowd. Both of them include the saying, whoever does what God wants is my mother and brother, etc. John, where is he on the authority of the now quite distant Jerusalem church? His brothers want him to go to Judea, and he doesn't wish to go to Judea because the Jews, that very distancing sense now at this end of the first century, are looking for an opportunity to kill him. And the evangelist comments, not even his brothers believed in him. And not believing in Jesus is the real definition of the fundamental sin in John at this time. That's fascinating, quite hostile, I think, for John, but like I say, a distant past. And another element in that story, I wonder what you think about this. You'll know the story very well. Jesus saw his mother and the disciples he loved standing beside her. He said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And from that hour, the disciple took Mary into his own home. And that's well known to us. And we think there are all sorts of meanings there, perhaps, for us. But on the face of it, what you're saying is that a woman who has several sons is being not given into their charge, which is what you would expect by Jesus, not into his brother's charge, but into somebody who is part of his faith community, not his family. What are we to make of that? By Pentecost, her sons were among the believers. Maybe by the late 90s, the Jerusalem church is simply, as it were, irrelevant to John's context. But by contrast, Acts was written somewhere in the 90s as well. And Acts certainly, as it were, has a very clear role of the importance of the Jerusalem church and of James within it. So there is a curious hostility. I think when I first learned to, as it were, ask this question about James, I was really taken aback by what I'd always seen as a very, very positive. Woman, here is your son, here is your mother. If anybody reflected on the history of the period, it would be quite odd to remember that that's what happened. And so we have different. Nigel?
Yeah, I think I read somewhere, I couldn't quote from which source, but in that area, like it was possible because Jesus was the eldest son.
Yes.
So in a sense, this is kind of, it was possible in a legal sense to give a last testament as you were dying. So that committal was, that was perhaps seen as legal. I mean, you could make too much of it.
I think exactly that. I think that's the kind of thing that commentators do. They look for sort of all sorts of historical reasons like that, and don't look at the plain face of it. What he's saying is, I'm not giving you to my brothers. And that's. I mean, maybe it's exactly like Mark's teaching. Who is my mother and my brother? Whoever does what God wants. It may be that idea of church, families being the crucial one. It's just that when it's taking place within a few decades of somebody, his eldest brother being really, or his next eldest brother being really important in the church, it's a fascinating that John, as it were, overrides that or ignores it in that way. Yeah, thank you. But like that whole idea about, you know, have we got a sort of a legal memorial here because that's what they did in the first century? I imagine we're all saying these are all arguments long since gone. Why are we concerned with them? And obviously you're going to be saying what Matthew and John said, what's relevant for my congregation. My point in all this redaction examination and the differences between the traditions is that redaction often targets the message to the context. And that's part of how probably we need to understand our texts. So if we think about what you're going to be doing for your assignment, you're going to be writing a critical reflection on a text in Luke. And you're going to be able to choose your text in Luke. Whatever you want to do, you can negotiate it with me. And you're going to write a sermon outline in relation to that sort of analysis that you've done. The sermon part much shorter. It's mostly an analysis using the skills we've been using in these sessions. I imagine you think, as I do, there can often be a tension between the kind of historical critical analysis that we're doing about, so what did Matthew really mean when he said that, and where does he get that from, and why does Luke have it differently, with what you might be wanting to say in a sermon. And I just want to reflect for a few minutes on that. Is a terrible, terrible, terrible picture of Jesus sort of forced into some bizarre 21st century persona. We need to be conscious, don't we, of the historical distance between then and now. Jesus was a rabbi, Jewish rabbi and prophet from early first century in Galilee and Judea. And his ethos was of a peasant community and adherence to Jewish covenant. That's where he comes from. That's where our Gospels on the whole come from. We're reading it an awful lot later. There's a gap between then and now. And as Christians and as people who believe that the Spirit mediates, we know there is a living meaning of the texts, that we can hear something for us now, not just then. But I don't think that means that we have what I've called here a naive assimilation of their past and our present. I don't think you can just say what happened then, clearly what ought to happen now. Sometimes you absolutely can. There are things that the Bible says that we say, I could preach on that anytime, and it's really helpful to see how that teaching of Jesus has an immediate response. John's Gospel, love one another. I don't think that's changed at all over the century. How we do it, that takes some serious reflection and application, but that we apply that love one another is not difficult to see across then and now. What are we going to do? What are the tools that we have to use? I shall list them when we get to fifth week, but as we use them week by week, we're trying to see the past. They shouldn't stop us seeing what is immediate and current. I found a cartoon that said something like that. I think I like this one. Seems like God is too far away from me. I just can't see anything. He's too far away. I think it expresses that idea that we're trying too hard to see something at a distance where there is an immediate meaning for us to apprehend. I don't want us to do that. I don't want us to get stuck in the past. I don't want us to say this is too far away and too foreign for us to be dealing with. But neither do I think you can do the sort of thing that this cartoon does. What would Jesus drive? It's like all those terrible questions. Would Jesus today have a vegan diet? Would he vote Liberal Democrat? Was Jesus a feminist? All those things that kind of, interesting, but you have to say, well, if we're going to address that, we have to ask an awful lot of other things too and recognize the difference of contexts. There's something to be done about moving from then to now that isn't just about, if I can use the phrase, naive assimilation, just saying it's exactly the same for us. Sometimes it isn't exactly the same for us. We're not first century Jewish fishermen, etc. Indeed, we're not, Christians in Antioch, whose big problem is the other Jews who are led by Pharisees. We have the same teaching from Jesus, but we need to apply it into our context. And so we've covered our agenda, I hope, or begun to think about these issues in Matthew. I'd like to talk a little bit more about Matthew with you, but I want, before I leave my slides, to remind you of what happens next. I hope you can read the Gospel of Luke. If you don't want to do it at a single sitting, you could look at the contents page of a commentary and see how they think it falls into divisions, or you can make up your mind for yourself where's a good place to stop off and begin again. Obviously, the cookbook, if you can read chapter 7, which talks a bit about Acts as well as Luke. The tool I'd like each week, I'd sort of trying to add a bit of a tool. I hope you had a chance to look at Step Bible, or will do soon. This time I'd really like you to check out one of the resources for looking at the synoptics in parallel, so that when you come to your essay, you've found a way of comparing text that is useful to you. If you can find a Throckmorton or buy a second-hand Throckmorton online, great. There is the website 5 Gospel Parallels with the 3 synoptics side by side for all of you. You may find other resources. Do let me know if you find a good one. If you are stuck for time, first of all, prioritize reading of the Gospel of Luke, then cook, and then anything else. We can stop the recording now if you like,